After defeating a hated and troublesome foe, the victor faces a difficult choice. What is to be done with the multitude of captured enemy soldiers whose lives now rest in your hands? Often numbering in the thousands, this great pool of manpower could be mercifully returned to the homeland, ransomed for a handsome profit, enslaved as a source of free labour, or simply put to death to ensure that they never raise their swords against you again. Yet perhaps an even more insidious but effective strategy is to render these men a permanent burden on society, ensuring that they are not only physically incapable of ever threatening you again, but also encumbering their fellow countrymen and would-be future rebels with the draining and permanent responsibility of providing care and sustenance for the rest of their lives. Such a callously efficient strategy would be utilized by the legendary Byzantine Emperor who became known to history as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, a man whose decades-long struggle against his Bulgarian enemies was finally brought to an end with a battle that became the scene of one of the most brutal and vindictive acts of retribution in history, when in a cold, calculating move, decades of resentment and fury were unleashed as the eyes of some 15,000 prisoners were burnt out of their sockets with red-hot pokers. This vicious mass blinding removing a stubborn thorn from his side, while also serving as a terrible warning to future would-be rebels of the fate that would await any man who dared to defy his will. When Basil II ascended to the Byzantine throne in 976 AD, years of ineffectual rule from his predecessors had left the empire he inherited in a perilous state. Beset by powerful foreign rivals on all sides, and with an economy that was proving unable to sustain the mighty armies that would be required to subdue his enemies abroad, the flame of this last bastion of Roman legacy in the east was burning dimly indeed. However, before Emperor Basil II even had the chance to begin addressing the encroachment of outsiders upon the empire's ever-shrinking borders, he was forced to contend with a dire threat to his authority coming from much closer to home. In Anatolia, powerful Byzantine aristocratic families had illegally amassed vast estates over the course of centuries of unchecked plots and intrigues, and were now effectively operating as independent feudal despots who merely paid lip service to the authority of the imperial court in Constantinople. With such enormous power at their disposal, two of the greatest of these families believed themselves strong enough to directly challenge the emperor and forge their own independent path, their ambition and confidence leading to two huge open rebellions against the young, newly crowned Basil II. Yet, despite nearly ending his reign before it had even begun, this tumultuous event would serve to forge Basil II in the fires of war and strife, providing him an early and valuable lesson in the arts of governing men, waging war, and winning over the indispensable support of influential allies, while at the same time diplomatically outmaneuvering his foes. With such a formidable force arrayed against him, to many at the time it must have seemed as though the emperor's short reign was already at an end, his brief period occupying the Byzantine throne doomed to become a mere footnote in the pages of history. However, Basil II would prove himself a man unwilling to simply fade into historical obscurity, and after securing an alliance with the leader of the nearby Rus, Vladimir of Kiev, using the hand of his sister in marriage to seal the deal, Basil II demonstrated his remarkable aptitude for war and politics as he led the Byzantine army along with his newly acquired 6,000 Russian mercenaries on a brutal but effective campaign to put down both rebellions, a feat he had against all odds achieved by 989 AD, in doing so finally suppressing the troublesome power of the empire's greatest noble families who had for so long plagued the monarch with the domination of the empire's administration and military. For the first time in years, a Byzantine emperor enjoyed the luxury of internal stability, Basil II's efforts creating a stable and solid base from which his future ambitions might finally be realized. Yet during these years of civil strife, the foreign enemies of the Byzantines had not sat idle. Taking advantage of the insurrections, the Fatimid Caliphate seized this once-in-a-generation opportunity and retook territory in the east that had previously been conquered by the Byzantines. With little respite to recover after crushing his internal enemies, Basil II was once again forced to take to the field to confront his external foes, throwing the Fatimids back as he pushed deep into Syria and Mesopotamia, forcing the Caliphate to accept a truce in 1000 AD. Yet this action in the east would prove to be just one chapter in the many foreign campaigns Basil II would oversee. Using a combination of brute military force and refined diplomacy, the increasingly battle-hardened emperor successfully incorporated large areas of Georgia, Armenia, the Crimea, the Balkans and southern Italy under Byzantine control, expanding the empire to its greatest extent in 4 centuries. However, he would become best known for his long, hard-fought and vindictive campaign against the hated Bulgarians to the west, a people who had made themselves his primary rival and a persistent, prickly thorn in his side that he was keen to remove once and for all. The roots of the rivalry between the Bulgarians and Byzantines were both deep and bitter. In the 5th century, the Bulgars had settled in the Balkans, in an area that had once belonged to the Eastern Roman Empire, a location that resulted in them being forced to fight a series of wars against the Byzantines to preserve their independence, leading to the Byzantines suffering a series of crushing and humiliating defeats, which even saw an emperor slain by the Bulgarians in battle, his skull reportedly lined with silver and used as a drinking cup by the victorious Bulgarian Khan Krum, a provocation which would not be forgotten. This long and vicious struggle for self-preservation seemed to have failed when large swathes of Bulgaria were successfully subjugated by the Byzantine Emperor John I. However, the embers of independence were kept burning by the existence of small areas of western Bulgaria that stubbornly remained out of the Byzantine Emperor's reach. In 970 AD, the 4 sons of a prominent Bulgarian noble raised the flag of rebellion against the Byzantine occupiers, taking full control of western Bulgaria before launching an assault on the Byzantine Empire directly, winning a series of victories and forcing the Byzantine army to retreat into the Crimea. It was following this defeat that the first of the 2 aristocrat-led rebellions, which had occupied so much of Basil II's early reign, had begun, and while occupied with this internal strife and other conflicts in the east, the Bulgarians, under the leadership of one of the 4 brother rebels, who had now crowned himself Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria, went on to greatly expand their territory and even launch lucrative raids deep into the Byzantines' Greek heartlands. This newly resurgent Bulgaria, under the competent and ambitious Tsar Samuel, had risen to become an existential threat to the Byzantines and Emperor Basil II, their now unchecked advance even potentially threatening Constantinople itself. The barbarian upstart had to be brought to heel before it was too late. During a brief period of peace in the middle of the 2 ruinous civil wars he was engaged in, Basil II was forced to launch a counterattack to allay the fears of his people, driving deep into Bulgarian territory in a desperate attempt to draw the rampaging Bulgarians away from southern Greece. However, this maneuver ended in complete disaster when on the 17th of August 986, the Byzantine army was ambushed and routed at the Battle of the Gates of Trajan, the Byzantine emperor barely escaping with his life as his personal treasure hoard fell into the hands of Tsar Samuel in yet another humiliation added to the already long list of grudges burned into the Byzantine national psyche, the contest between the 2 rivals now becoming something more akin to a vendetta than a conventional war. Years of skirmishes followed, however in 1000 AD, an implacable Basil II would return to exact vengeance, having finally established stability within his empire and dealt with outside threats in the east, the memory of the slights he had suffered at the hands of the Bulgarians likely still fresh in his mind. Having secured a base of operations, Basil launched a series of offensives which gradually and methodically pushed the Bulgarians back over the course of 10 long and grueling years, eventually re-establishing the earlier imperial borders and even capturing the old Bulgarian capital, forcing the weakened Tsar Samuel to retreat into a defensive position in a mountainous area known as Kleidion. Although well defended in the mountain encampment, the elusive Bulgarian army, which for so long relied on its maneuverability to conduct hit-and-run raids deep into Byzantine territory, was now finally pinned down, and on the 29th of July 1014, Emperor Basil II and Tsar Samuel would clash in what became the final showdown of the decades-long, bitter and drawn-out rivalry. Safely located behind a fortified mountain pass, the Bulgarians were confident that any attack by the Byzantines could be easily repulsed with a huge loss of life for the enemy. However, Basil II was unwilling to let an opportunity to finally destroy his cornered nemesis pass him by, and ordered one of his generals to take a detachment of men to covertly seek out a path that might lead around the Bulgarian position, while Basil himself remained in full view as an ominous distraction, fixing the attention of the Bulgarians firmly on the fortified front line they had carefully constructed, but leaving them dangerously overconfident that the rear was secured. With luck on their side, the Byzantine general was able to outmaneuver the Bulgarians while remaining undetected, only appearing in view as he launched a vicious attack on their undefended rear, taking them by complete surprise and luring large numbers of men to abandon their defensive towers at the front to meet this new and deadly threat to their rear. With the fortified front now severely weakened, Basil seized his chance and launched an all-out attack, trapping the Bulgarians in a masterfully executed pincer movement as his main force finally broke through the blocked mountain pass and wreaked havoc on the trapped and now panicked Bulgarian army. In the ensuing chaos and slaughter, the entire Bulgarian position was completely overwhelmed, with Tsar Samuel barely escaping with his life, thanks to the heroism of his son, who managed to aid his escape on horseback. Completely surrounded and now abandoned by the Tsar, some 15,000 surviving Bulgarians were forced to surrender. However, there would be little mercy forthcoming from Emperor Basil II, a man whose pent-up resentment for the people who had caused him so much trouble had been simmering for decades. Warfare in the pre-modern world was brutal and harsh indeed, following no established code on how prisoners should be treated. The vanquished were entirely at the mercy of the victor, a reality that was cruelly exposed by the retribution Emperor Basil II exacted on his defeated foes. Every man of the 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners was arranged into groups of 100 before having their eyes either gouged out with a simple blade or burnt away with a red-hot poker, the exact method used unspecified in the historical record. According to the legend, one man out of every group of 100 was allowed to keep a single eye, not through any form of generosity or mercy, but so that he could lead the remaining 99 back home to Bulgaria. The grisly sight of his once proud and mighty army returning home robbed of their sight, said to have caused Tsar Samuel to die from shock, either from a heart attack or a stroke, the unthinkable torment of so many, forever earning Emperor Basil II the nickname of the Bulgar Slayer. Blinding as a punishment was nothing new for the Byzantines, and was surprisingly considered far more civilized than outright execution. The taking of a man's sight considered the appropriate punishment for those who dared to revolt against the emperor, the eyeless sockets of the condemned permanently marking them out for their treachery, and rendering them unable to ever take the throne for themselves. It's unknown whether the mass blinding of the 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners was ordered out of petty vindictiveness as a punishment for men considered rebels rather than foreigners, or as sometimes suggested in retaliation for the death of Basil's favourite general and advisor, but what is known is the crushing effect the act would have had on Bulgarian morale and the wider nation itself. Life at that time was already hard enough, but life without one's eyes would prove to be near impossible without the care and assistance of others. each blinded man unlikely to have been able to earn an adequate income of any kind, and thus rendered a financial burden upon his family, friends, and community. The mass blinding acting as a kind of economic attack on the rest of the Bulgarian people, as well as a cruel warning of the fate that would await any others who might continue to resist Byzantine rule. Doomed to spend the remaining years of life in abject poverty and misery, the defeated Bulgarian army would have spread the tale to every corner of Bulgaria, with few towns and villages likely to have remained unmarked by the tragedy. Regardless of the reasoning behind Basil's vengeance, the aftermath of the battle could not be argued with, and despite fighting on for another 4 years, the Battle of Kleidion and the blinding of the 15,000 had irreversibly broken the ability of the Bulgarians to offer up any meaningful resistance, their eventual submission to Basil the Bulgar Slayer, ensuring Byzantine domination of the Balkans and cementing Basil II's place in history. I hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.